You won't believe what happened after my HOA. Karen listed my house for sale without my permission. Stick around to find out how I turned the tables on her and what I did when I realized she didn't know I was a real estate lawyer. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. It all started on a quiet, sunny morning in suburban bliss. For years, my family had lived in the same charming neighborhood, a place where everything seemed picture perfect. Well-maintained lawns, tidy streets, and everyone in their place. It was the kind of place where neighbors smiled and waved, and the worst scandal anyone could imagine was a hedge that grew a little too tall or a fence with a chipped paint spot. As a homeowner, I had always respected the rules of the Homeowners Association, HOA, although I didn't always agree with their decisions. Still, I was careful to maintain a low profile, keeping to myself and staying out of their way. After all, the HOA was a collection of well-meaning but occasionally overzealous individuals who had a tendency to micromanage every aspect of life in the neighborhood. But then there was her, Karen, or at least that's what I had secretly begun to call her. Karen was one of those individuals who had far too much time on her hands and had chosen to devote it to enforcing the most trivial and ridiculous rules of the HOA. She was always on the lookout for any infraction, real or imagined, and her eyes were particularly focused on my house. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she was just doing her job, right? However, soon enough, I realized that this was no longer about rules. It was personal. Every few days, I would receive notices in my mailbox, each one detailing a new supposed violation of the HOA guidelines. The first one was for something ridiculous. My grass was a fraction of an inch too high. I couldn't believe it. I had spent hours tending to my lawn, making sure it was healthy and well-maintained. I wasn't a lazy homeowner. I took pride in my property. Yet, Karen had singled me out. I did what any reasonable person would do. I corrected the issue, trimmed the grass even shorter, and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next week, I got another notice. This time, it was from my mailbox, which Karen claimed was not up to HOA standards, despite the fact that it was perfectly within the guidelines when I installed it years ago. There was nothing wrong with it, just a small, routine maintenance issue that anyone could overlook. I started to get frustrated. It was clear that Karen was targeting me, but I wasn't sure why. Maybe she didn't like my style, or perhaps she just had too much power and time on her hands. Then the notices kept coming. A week later, I got one about my fence, which she claimed was deteriorating because of a single spot of chipped paint. It wasn't even something that stood out. In fact, it was barely noticeable unless you were looking for something to complain about. But Karen wasn't satisfied. It became apparent that she had taken it upon herself to scrutinize every detail of my property with a microscope. It wasn't just one or two issues. It was a laundry list of complaints that seemed to be growing with each passing day. And no matter how much I tried to address each complaint, it was never enough. At first, I considered ignoring it. After all, I had corrected every complaint, even when they seemed petty. But there was something about Karen's behavior that started to wear on me. It was as though she had become obsessed with finding fault in every aspect of my home. I began to wonder what her motivation was. I wasn't a troublemaker. I wasn't breaking any major rules, and I certainly wasn't trying to be the HOA's enemy. So why was she targeting me? It didn't take long for me to start investigating her further. Karen wasn't just any regular HOA member. She was someone who had apparently risen to a position of power. And the more I dug, the more I found that she was someone who took her role very seriously, perhaps a bit too seriously. In fact, I began to notice that her power seemed to go to her head. She would drop by unannounced at people's homes, giving unsolicited advice on how to maintain their properties, acting as if she were the ultimate authority on all things related to the neighborhood. And it wasn't just me. As I spoke to other neighbors, I realized that Karen had a history of picking on homeowners she didn't like for various, often trivial reasons. No one was ever good enough for her standards. Then one day, something happened that made me realize just how far Karen was willing to go. I came home from work, exhausted and ready to relax, only to be met by a large notice on my front door. I immediately recognized the HOA logo, but when I opened it, I was stunned to read the content. The notice stated that I had violated multiple HOA rules, and I was being fined for not complying with them. But the strangest part? It said my house was being delisted from the HOA's approved listings of properties, and that I had violated terms of service as if I was involved in some sort of shady real estate deal. It didn't make any sense. It sounded like a major overstep, but the most surprising part of it all was that the notice also mentioned something about my house being up for sale. Wait, what? Confused and alarmed, I immediately checked the real estate websites. To my disbelief, there was my house listed for sale. Not just any simple listing, but a full description complete with photos of my home and a price that I definitely hadn't agreed upon. My heart sank as I read the listing. Not only was it false, but it was also incredibly damaging. The description included bizarre, fabricated details about my supposed decision to sell the home, with claims that I was relocating for work or something equally outlandish. It seemed as though Karen had gone to the extreme of fabricating a story and posting it on multiple online real estate platforms. I couldn't believe it. Karen had listed my house for sale without my consent, and what was worse, she had made a spectacle of it online, potentially causing irreparable harm to my reputation and personal life. I stood there dumbfounded. How could this happen? I was a real estate lawyer, for crying out loud. I understood the intricacies of property law, the processes involved in listing a house, and the implications of such a stunt. I was shocked and angered that anyone, would have the audacity to mess with my livelihood like this. But Karen had done it, and it was clear that she had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know that I was fully capable of fighting back with everything I had. The moment I saw my house listed online, I knew this was no longer just a matter of minor neighborhood disputes. This was a serious issue, and I was about to take action. The moment I saw my house listed for sale without my consent, I knew that this was no longer something I could simply ignore or handle with a polite phone call. As a real estate lawyer, I understood the gravity of what Karen had done. Listing someone's home for sale without their permission was not only a violation of privacy, but could also be seen as fraud. She had not just crossed the line, she had shattered it. The sheer audacity of her actions left me stunned, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. I had spent years helping clients navigate legal challenges, and now I was facing one of my own. I knew exactly what needed to be done. First things first, I needed to document everything. I immediately took screenshots of the real estate listings with my home's details on them, making sure to capture the absurd description and the price that had been listed. I also saved all the emails and notices from the HOA that had been piling up over the past few weeks. Every single communication from Karen was evidence of a larger pattern of harassment and misconduct. I wanted to ensure that I had a rock-solid case, should it come to that. The thing that made this particularly dangerous was that Karen was a member of the HOA, an organization with a certain level of authority in the neighborhood. She wasn't just a random neighbor. She had power, or at least she thought she did. This made her actions all the more insidious because she had used her position to personally attack me. It wasn't just a simple matter of listing my home online. Karen had misused her authority to create chaos in my life. I immediately contacted my attorney, a trusted colleague from law school who specialized in real estate and property law. I needed legal advice, and I needed it fast. He was shocked to hear the details of the situation, but agreed that this was something we needed to address immediately. We discussed potential legal options, including filing for a cease and desist order, defamation claims, and even potential civil charges. While I wasn't eager to go public with this dispute, I knew that I couldn't allow Karen to continue with her vendetta without consequences. While we started preparing a strategy, I knew I had to address the HOA itself. The fact that Karen was using the HOA as her personal tool to target me was disturbing, and I wasn't going to let it slide. I decided to take a formal approach and sent a letter to the HOA board, outlining the situation and demanding immediate action. I was clear that Karen's actions had crossed the line from petty complaints to outright harassment and fraud, and I requested an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. I was meticulous in explaining how Karen's behavior violated HOA guidelines and how her actions had impacted my personal and professional life. I included copies of the listing, the HOA notices, and a detailed timeline of events. I didn't want there to be any doubt about the seriousness of the situation. What happened next was somewhat surprising. The HOA board responded quickly, although I wasn't sure whether it was due to my legal background or just the sheer boldness of the accusation. They scheduled a meeting to address my concerns, and for the first time, I felt like I was being taken seriously. I didn't expect them to immediately take my side, but I did expect them to acknowledge the severity of what had transpired. When a meeting came, I showed up prepared. I had all the documentation and evidence laid out in front of me, and I presented my case calmly but firmly. I explained how Karen's actions had violated my privacy, caused emotional distress, and, most importantly, misused the HOA's power to target me personally. I made it clear that I was not just a homeowner. I was a real estate lawyer, and I knew exactly how to handle a situation like this. To my surprise, the HOA board seemed somewhat sympathetic. They acknowledged that Karen's actions had been inappropriate and that it was not acceptable for her to use the HOA platform for personal vendettas. One board member, who had known Karen for years, seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of her behavior. He admitted that Karen had always been a bit overzealous in her enforcement of the rules, but no one had expected her to go this far. After much deliberation, the board promised to take disciplinary action against Karen, including a formal warning and a review of her position within the HOA. While I appreciated the board's acknowledgement, I knew this wasn't enough. This was a legal matter now, not just a neighborhood dispute. After all, the damage had been done. My reputation had been put in jeopardy, and I was still facing the fallout from Karen's actions. I had to take further steps to ensure that I wasn't just appeased with empty promises. I was already in the process of preparing a cease and desist letter, but I also wanted to take legal action against Karen directly. It wasn't just about restoring my peace of mind. It was about sending a message that actions like hers would not be tolerated. As I moved forward with the legal proceedings, I was struck by the emotional toll this entire ordeal had taken on me. I had always been a professional, always willing to handle conflicts with a level head, but this situation felt personal. It wasn't just about me losing control of a situation. It was about someone misusing their power to try to ruin my life. I began to realize just how vulnerable we can all be to the actions of others when they choose to wield power unfairly. In this case, Karen had attempted to strip me of my privacy and professional integrity for no reason other than her personal vendetta. The legal battle ahead was going to be complicated, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself from further harm. Meanwhile, Karen, for all her arrogance and power within the HOA, had no idea who she had crossed. I knew that her listing was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate attempt to cause chaos in my life. In my world, where property deals and legal contracts were second nature, Karen had made an error that would cost her much more than she had bargained for. In the coming weeks, I prepared for the worst but hoped for the best. While my attorney and I continued to prepare our case, I remained vigilant, documenting everything that occurred. I knew this battle wouldn't end overnight, but it would send a clear message that the misuse of power, whether by an HOA member or anyone else, would not be tolerated. It was time for Karen to face the consequences of her actions. The weeks following my initial confrontation with the HOA were tense, filled with preparation and uncertainty. I was deeply invested in seeing this through, not just because of the personal impact Karen's actions had on me, but also because I knew that standing up against her would set a precedent for how overzealous HOA members could be held accountable. I had dealt with similar cases in my legal career, but this was personal, and I had no intention of letting her off the hook. Every day, I reviewed the evidence and communicated with my attorney to ensure we had a solid case. During this time, the HOA board seemed to be making efforts to rectify the situation on their end, though it was clear that Karen had no intention of backing down easily. She wasn't someone who would admit fault or accept responsibility for her behavior. As the days went by, I started to notice a shift in the neighborhood dynamics. Neighbors who had once been friendly now seemed hesitant to engage with me, and some avoided eye contact. Word had spread about the situation, and I could tell that Karen had already started to paint a picture of me as a troublemaker, someone who was attacking the HOA. I knew that I couldn't let this continue unchecked. If I didn't take action, my reputation in the neighborhood would suffer, and it might even affect my professional standing. The final straw came when Karen, in her typical overbearing fashion, decided to escalate things further. One afternoon, I came home to find a letter waiting for me from the HOA. The letter, which I assumed was a formal update about the ongoing dispute, turned out to be something more insidious. It was a demand for me to appear before the HOA board for another hearing. But this time, the letter was filled with unfounded accusations, suggesting that I had caused disruptions in the community and had been actively harassing HOA members. The letter claimed that I had been threatening Karen and that I was using my legal expertise to intimidate her. The allegations were completely baseless and appear to be another desperate attempt by Karen to paint me as the villain. When I read that letter, a mix of emotions surged within me: anger, frustration, and disbelief. Karen was clearly trying to manipulate the HOA board into siding with her by twisting the narrative. I immediately knew that I needed to take a more direct approach, one that would leave no room for doubt about who was in the right. This wasn't just about protecting my reputation anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable for the harm she had caused. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney to strategize our next steps. It was clear that Karen was digging her heels in and had no intention of backing down. My attorney, a calm and level-headed individual, advised that we should prepare for a full legal battle. But I was growing increasingly tired of the back and forth. I didn't want to keep dragging the matter out in front of the HOA or in court. It was taking a toll on me emotionally and mentally. As we strategized, we discussed the possibility of reaching a settlement. Perhaps Karen could be made to issue a public apology or face other penalties. But something about the idea of letting her off with only a slap on the wrist didn't sit well with me. I didn't want to give Karen the chance to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. This wasn't just about her harassment of me. It was about sending a message to the entire neighborhood that no one, especially someone in a position of power, could exploit the HOA to harm others without repercussions. It was then that I made a decision. I would take the situation head-on, with full force. I wanted a resolution that would not only vindicate me, but also restore my peace of mind. It was time to confront Karen directly, and I would do so in the most professional yet unflinching way possible. I had seen this kind of manipulation before, but I was determined to end it once and for all. The next day, I showed up at the HOA board meeting prepared to present my case once again. This time, however, I had a secret weapon. I had obtained a legal document that would require Karen to personally respond to all the accusations against her. This wasn't just another letter or formal complaint. It was a demand for a deposition, something that would force her to answer for her actions under oath. I knew that if Karen was forced to sit down and answer for her behavior in a legal setting, she wouldn't be able to hide behind her usual manipulations. As the meeting began, I calmly addressed the board. I began by reviewing the events of the past few months, laying out each detail in chronological order. I showed them the screenshots of the listings she had posted for my house, explained how her actions had caused irreparable damage to my reputation, and outlined the emotional distress I had endured because of her vendetta. I also provided clear evidence of her manipulations, pointing out how she had tried to paint me as the villain in the situation. When I finally brought out the legal document, the one that would force Karen to appear for a deposition, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The board members looked at each other in surprise, clearly taken aback by the seriousness of the situation. Karen, who had been sitting quietly at the table, suddenly shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wasn't expecting this level of confrontation. I could see her face redden as I calmly explained the legal ramifications of her actions. I wasn't just a homeowner now, I was a real estate lawyer, and I knew how to hold people accountable. The meeting ended with a vote by the HOA board. They decided to formally reprimand Karen and remove her from her position within the HOA. But more than that, they agreed to allow me to pursue a legal case against her for defamation and the fraudulent listing of my property. In addition, they instructed Karen to issue a formal apology to me, which I was to approve before it could be made public. I left the meeting that day with a sense of relief and vindication. Karen had been put in her place, and I had successfully navigated the entire situation without backing down. In the weeks that followed, Karen's actions came to light, and the neighborhood began to see her for who she truly was. Someone who abused her power and tried to destroy someone else's life out of spite. As for me, I was finally able to put the entire ordeal behind me. The legal proceedings were a formality at that point, and Karen's apology was a small but significant step toward closure. It wasn't just about winning, it was about standing up for what was right and ensuring that no one could misuse the system to harm others. The experience left me with a greater sense of resolve. Sometimes, standing up for yourself in the face of unjust treatment isn't easy, but it's always worth it. And sometimes the best way to deal with it, Karen, is not to back down, but to face them head-on with the power of knowledge and the law.